Dear colleagues, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear speakers, thank you very much for coming today to this conference of the Patriots for Europe Foundation on debunking gender ideology and how we can defend our kids. Leave our kids alone, that's the slogan of this conference. If you've seen the invitation, and I'm sure you did, otherwise you wouldn't be here, you probably saw that we have a very strong lineup of speakers today, whom we have divided into three different panel discussions. The first one will focus, of course, on what gender ideology is and what kind of detrimental effects it has had on our families, on individuals, because now gender ideology is not just some theoretical phenomenon. In many countries, we have seen it spread for many years now. We have seen many people trying to transition from male to female or the other way around. We have seen very dramatic personal stories, dramatic family stories happen out of this poisonous ideology. And we'd like to prevent the further spread of this. That's why the second panel afterwards will focus on what is the European framework, what is the European context to this, what the European Parliament is doing, what the European Commission is doing in this sense. And of course, many of you know that the European Commission has just recently published the second five-year strategy on LGBTIQ plus equality subject, which I hope the experts will also discuss in the panel. And last but not least, we want to have a panel discussion about family policy, which can promote healthy families, healthy societies in Europe, what it means and what families need in Europe in the current situation to have the number of children they want, to what it means to live in a healthy family, and how European governments, or maybe even the EU, can promote, incentivize this. Of course, it's national competence, but hearing good examples from different member states, hearing good examples from experts is always welcome. It allows for the sharing of know-how, and I think this way we can treat both the negative side of the subject, the regulatory side of the subject, and of course, what we can do in a positive sense on this issue to help women, to help families, and to help the future of Europe. And for that reason, I am very glad that we can have this conference here in the European Parliament. It is not often that we are allowed to discuss such debates in official committee meetings, but at this conference, we now have this opportunity. And I thank very much all of you for coming. And I wish you a very pleasant and useful conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Laszlo. Now I'd like to call to the stage Ms. Mia Hughes, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and GenSpec's Senior Researcher. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the invitation here today. In the first decade of this century, the Western world lost its grip on reality when a brand new type of human being was conjured into existence by the collision of political activism and medicine. That new type of human was the transgender child. Despite this idea defying everything known about childhood development, large swathes of society seemingly overnight began believing the unbelievable, that children could be born in the wrong body. Today I'm going to explain how that came to be and how the widespread acceptance of this dangerous falsehood led to the worst medical scandal in the history of modern medicine. The seedlings of the idea were sown in psychiatry in the 1980s with the diagnosis of gender identity disorder of childhood, But it needed political activism and the cooperation of endocrinology to bring the idea to life. Because once there was an official diagnosis, along came the medical solution, puberty suppression, developed in the Netherlands in the 1990s. This idea to halt the puberty of gender-distressed youth was actually born out of a failed experiment. When the Dutch realized that the first wave of men in their sex change experiment were unhappy with the results because they didn't look like women, the researchers didn't hang up their lab coats and accept that the experiment had been a failure. Instead, they turned their attention to children, reasoning that intervening sooner would produce more pleasing cosmetic results in adulthood. It was this unfathomable idea that brought the concept of the transgender child to life, because before puberty blockers, it was impossible to lie to a gender nonconforming child, a little boy, and raise him as a girl, or vice versa, with puberty looming on the horizon. But when the Dutch made puberty optional, they handed deeply misguided adults the means to sever children from the reality of their bodies before they were even old enough to understand what that meant. At the same time, a critical shift central to the theme of today's event was unfolding in transactivism. In the 1990s, while the Dutch were launching their experiment on adolescents, early transactivists decided to redefine transgender identities as innate and healthy, rather than rooted in mental disorder or paraphilic desire. This wasn't grounded in new science, it was strategic rebranding. The old labels, while accurate, didn't suit the movement's political goals. The concept of the transgender child, freshly minted by medicine, fit perfectly into this new narrative. If trans identities are innate, then transgender children must exist. And if transgender children exist, then trans identities must be natural, not pathological or deviant. It was a self-justifying loop, circular, compelling, but entirely false, rooted not in evidence, but in ideology. In the decade that followed, so-called trans kids were thrust onto the forefront of what was framed as a civil rights struggle. This devastating convergence of medical, political, and cultural forces ensured that countless children, instead of being given the freedom to grow, mature, and discover different identities, were locked into a lifetime of medicalization, embodying an identity imposed upon them before they were old enough to understand what was at stake. If you pay close attention, you'll see that every story of a so-called trans child, it consists of nothing more than stereotypes. Little boys who like Barbies and princess gowns, and tomboys with short hair and a dislike of dresses. What separates a gender nonconforming child from a trans child is not biology, but belief. Specifically, the child's belief that they are the opposite sex, usually shaped by the beliefs of the adults around them. And in our upside-down world, the child leads and the adults follow. Yet, only a society in the grips of collective madness could treat children as wise oracles, capable of divining their authentic gender soul while they're still young enough to believe in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. Then in the mid-2010s, disaster struck. Starting around 2014, pediatric gender clinics across the Western world began to fill with an entirely new patient cohort, adolescent girls claiming to be boys. The surge was so sudden and the inflection point so obvious that in a sane era, clinicians would have scrambled to find the trigger of what was clearly a social contagion. Instead, in the age of trans rights, nobody even bothered to look. And it wouldn't have taken much effort to find the answer. Just a glance at the cultural messaging of the time would have revealed it. Because 2014 was the year Laverne Cox appeared on the cover of Time magazine with the headline, "The Transgender Tipping Point, America's Next Civil Rights Frontier." And with that, the modern trans rights movement launched its global assault on reality. Trans-identified celebrities were everywhere. Trans characters appeared in children's books and television shows. Trans influencers proliferated with astonishing speed online. And schools began teaching gender identity ideology as if it were scientific fact. And in a perfect storm scenario, smartphones and social media exploded in popularity at exactly the right moment, creating the ideal super-spreading environment for this seductive idea to go viral. The message adolescents received was simple. If you hate your body, that could be a sign that you're trans. And right on cue, legions of confused adolescents who hate their developing bodies started showing up at gender clinics, believing themselves to be trans. Simple cause and effect. And what has happened to all those confused kids who had the misfortune to find themselves funneled into gender clinics during this era? Many were placed on a medical pathway that simply defies belief. One where doctors induce endocrine disorders into healthy children using puberty blockers that weaken bones and disrupt normal development, and massive doses of cross-sex hormones that can sterilize and cause severe long-term risks. Where surgeons amputate the healthy breasts of teenage girls, invert the penises of young men, often before their first sexual encounter, remove functioning reproductive organs, and even sew appendages made out of forearm flesh onto women's groins. It sounds like a horror film, but they call it medicine, gender-affirming care. These victims of this medical crime aren't cancer patients or people suffering from life-threatening illnesses. They're healthy young people swept up in this powerful cultural storm, because society didn't have the courage to say no to the outrageous demands of trans activists. And of note, every systematic review conducted thus far has concluded that there is no good quality evidence supporting this drastic medical pathway for youth. No proof that it is safe, beneficial, or leads to positive long-term outcomes. Meanwhile, the harms are clear and indisputable. So this raises an important question. Do the experts in so-called gender-affirming care genuinely believe adolescents can consent to treatments that could permanently impair their fertility? Publicly, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health says yes, they can. Privately, the answer is a very different story. In the leaked WPATH files, internal communications from WPATH's messaging forum that Michael Schellenberger and I released last year, a leading pediatric endocrinologist admitted that discussing fertility preservation with a 14-year-old is like, and I quote, talking to a blank wall. I know this to be true because at 14, I, like so many other women, was that blank wall. And today at 47, I'm the proud mother of 3 children, and they have brought more joy into my life than my teenage self ever could have imagined. These doctors also know full well the consequences of the interventions they prescribe. In the WPATH files, members discuss how puberty blockers and estrogen can leave young males never able to achieve orgasm, and how testosterone causes vaginal and uterine atrophy in teenage girls that is so severe it leads to debilitating pain and bleeding. But at no point in the WPATH files does anyone question whether it's ethical to destroy healthy young bodies in this way, because no one expresses any concern about allowing young people to sacrifice their fertility and their sexual function before they're old enough to understand what that means. Because first do no harm has no place in their ideological quest. It's the darkest irony of our time that in order to be a good person or a good progressive nation, you must support and celebrate this atrocious medical crime. At the behest of a political movement with no grounding in truth, you must be willing to fill innocent children's heads with absurd, dangerous lies. And anyone who tries to protect children is demonized. Now in 2025, the scandal of gender medicine has reached a moment of chaotic, polarized action. In the United States, red states have banned youth gender medicine, while blue states double down and become sanctuary states. In Canada, it's full steam ahead, except for Alberta, where Premier Danielle Smith is doing her utmost to protect children and facing legal action by trans activist groups for her efforts. The UK has banned puberty blockers, yet simultaneously has a clinical trial in the works that will expose more healthy young children to these harmful drugs. And here in Europe, Sweden and Finland have reversed course after finding insufficient evidence to support trans in kids. A Belgian family has launched a lawsuit alleging medical negligence after the suicide of their trans-identified teenage daughter. And numerous other nations have moved to restrict access to these experimental drugs. Yet, at the same time, the EU has unveiled an equality strategy that recommends gender self-ID for children and seeks to embed the fictional concept of gender identity into every major EU policy framework, while punishing member states that attempt to shield children from the danger. And for those over 18, the medical scandal continues unabated. In short, no one can agree on what to do, but the answer is actually very simple. Restore reality, defend the right of children to a childhood grounded in truth, and the right of all young people to grow up healthy and whole. Stop bombarding young people with an incoherent, anti-reality political ideology, and stop protecting them from it instead. Reject prioritizing the desires of extremist activists over the safeguarding of children, and face the reality that trans kids do not exist. What exists are gender nonconforming children and confused adolescents trying to make sense of themselves in a world that has abandoned reason in favor of ideology. Young people being lied to at a crucial stage of identity development who face consequences that will haunt them for a lifetime. Children don't need to learn about fictional gender identities in school. They don't need their heads filled with the poisonous lie that they get to choose whether they are boys or girls. And they no more need trans role models than they do anorexic or bulimic role models. So that brings me to why I'm here today in the Parliament of the European Union. The EU has lost its way when it allowed itself to fall under the spell of trans activism, and it's long past time to correct that course, because EU values are supposed to protect the vulnerable, and if those values do not protect children first and foremost, then they have no value at all. Thank you. Should I stay here? So I'm on the first panel.
Thank you, Ms. Hughes, for the very poignant and all-encompassing keynote. Now I'd like to transition to the first panel. The first panel will, if we could please welcome the speakers to the stage. Ms. Margarita de la Pisa Carrión, Vox MEP from Spain, Luka Hein, detransitioner from the US, Mia Hughes, who's already here on stage, and Ms. Jamie Reed, whistleblower and former manager at the Pediatric Center, Transgender Center, at Washington University School of Medicine, and at St. Louis Children's Hospital. Thank you.
You want me to move?
So first and foremost, thank you everyone for joining us. This is a very important discussion today, which is not just a political discussion, but profoundly human. This first panel, titled Leave Our Kids Alone, Why Gender Ideology Poses a Threat to Children, brings together invaluable firsthand experience, researchers and policymakers who have seen this issue from the inside. So it takes every single side of the discussion around gender ideology. But before we get into it, I'd like to give the opportunity for our speakers to introduce themselves, their work, and their side of the story. So if we would like to start with Ms. Reed.
This is my full statement.
Yeah.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Jamie Reed, and I am a clinical researcher, a lesbian, a mom, and the whistleblower from the United States who spent nearly 5 years working inside of a pediatric gender center, one of the busiest and fastest growing clinics of its kind in the region. I entered the work with compassion and the belief that I was helping vulnerable young people. I coordinated care, I met with families in crisis, and I walked teenagers through this process of medicalization. I saw thousands of patients, read thousands of pages of medical records, and I sat in the meetings with families where irreversible decisions were made. And slowly, I saw a pattern I could not ignore. The mental health issues were being unaddressed, patients with autism were being overlooked, and trauma was bypassed. Teens were carrying layers of pain and being handled one single explanation for it all. I raised concerns, I asked questions, and I begged for guardrails. And when I saw this harm happening in real time and nothing changing, I did the hardest thing that I've ever done. I became a public whistleblower, not because it was safe or convenient, but because children were being swept into something that they could not possibly understand. There is a psychiatrist in the United States who is one of the loudest defenders of medical transition of children. He is named Jack Turbin. You have very similar doctors like these in all of your countries. He said something very recently. He said, if someone says gender ideology one more time like it means something, I'm going to lose my mind. So today I want to answer 2 questions plainly. Are we battling an ideology? And if so, why does it grip children so tightly? I believe we are dealing with an ideology because gender is a belief system. It is a story about the human person treated as unquestionable. It claims that a child has an inner, invisible gendered soul more true than their body, and that this inner truth must guide medical decisions. This is not established science. This is a worldview, a metaphysical worldview. But it is a story so emotionally appealing that many people confuse it for compassion. Why does it grip children? Because children live closer to the magical world than we do. Because when you are young, the universe feels alive and intimate and enormous all at once. Because children still believe that the moon can follow them home. What a beautiful thing that is. They believe that the moon is following them, to feel the world bending towards you, to feel seen by something vast and bright. That is childhood. Gender ideology is not simply misguided, it is insidious because it goes right at that target. It targets childhood. It eats at children from the inside out. It takes that wide open horizon and bends it towards this doctrine that tells a child that their body must be wrong, that their self is fragile, and that boundaries can be dissolved. At its core, this is an ideology that is about erasing boundaries, biological, developmental, psychological, parental. It tells young people, you are limitless, but only if you sever yourself from your body. You are authentic, but only if you declare yourself incomplete. And you are free, but only if you first believe that you are broken. I saw this firsthand, and I watched vulnerable young people be given a single narrative for all of their pain. Children still believe that the moon can follow them home, and gender ideology turns that tenderness into confusion, doubt, and disorientation. This leads us to another truth. Why do the Jacks of the world react so fiercely when we call this an ideology? They cannot allow this to be called an ideology, because if it is an ideology, then it is a belief system. And in a pluralistic society, in a democracy, in a republic, and in the European Union, beliefs have a protected place, but not a governing place. We do not base medical policy on metaphysics. We do not build laws based on spiritual frameworks, and we do not reshape child safeguarding around private cosmologies. Beliefs can be held, but beliefs do not govern medicine. So, of course, the Jacks of the world insist that this is settled science, because if it is a belief, then it must return to the private sphere, not the public square. And beliefs do not get to override biology, do not get to dictate medical practice, and we must ensure that they do not get to continue to medicalize children. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Reed. Now I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Luka Hein, who will share her insights.
My name is Luka Hein. I am currently 23 years old, and I am what is considered a detransitioner. As a young teenager, I began to experience a lot of confounding factors happening in my life. My parents had a messy divorce. I was spending too much time online, and I had just transferred to a new school. My mental health began to decline rapidly, and in a world where I needed strong boundaries and I needed the adults in my life to give me a safe place to rest and put those boundaries up, they instead affirmed the chaos I was going through into reality. I fell into spaces where I was told that everything about my body was wrong. Any normal discomfort I was having with puberty meant that my body was wrong and I was born in the wrong body and I needed to be fixed. At 16, before being put on any kind of hormonal treatment, I had a double mastectomy. A few months later, I was put on testosterone, and I took that until I was 20. And by the time that I realized that it was not my body that was wrong, I just needed other kinds of help, it was too late. My breasts were gone, my joints hurt, I was dealing with atrophy and a number of other health issues. In my scramble to detransition, I tried to salvage what was left and return to the gender clinic that had transitioned me, only to be sent away with a "this is just part of your gender journey." I was left alone and hopeless and did not know where to turn. As I detransitioned, I truly realized just how cruel it was to take a struggling teenager that felt so unsure of themselves and just tell them that every single thing about them was wrong, down to their physical being, and that every single thing needed to be changed in order to make them right, to make them whole. There's a certain level of cruelty in telling that to a teenager, that to be whole they must chop parts of themselves off, that there really isn't words for. At 23, I have tried my best to move past what has happened to me as a teenager. But in some aspects, I truly never will. I don't know how this will impact whether or not I can have children. I most certainly cannot breastfeed. And every single time I undress, I have to take a part of me off, and the scars are still there. There is no fixing what happened. There's only moving forward and trying to recover what is salvageable. I needed those adults in my life to be a safe place for me. I was craving boundaries, and I was craving care and actual help. I had been a victim of grooming, a messy divorce, and had no sense of self at the time when all this happened. I needed a world that was grounded in truth, and instead I was just fed lie after lie about what it meant to be myself, what it meant to be healthy, and what it meant to be whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Luka, for your honesty and your bravery. Ms. Hughes, if you'd like to give a small introduction, otherwise we can move.
Should I just introduce myself?
Yes.
I already spoke.
Yes.
So my name is Mia Hughes. I live in Canada. I'm a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, where I cover the gender issue. And I'm also a senior researcher with GenSpect. And in 2024, March 2024, Michael Schellenberger and I released the WPATH files, which were leaked internal communications from the World Professional Association for Transgender Health that showed the group for what it is, a trans activist group masquerading as a medical association, advocating for a reckless medical experiment to be performed on children, adolescents, and vulnerable adults in the complete absence of any solid scientific justification. So I opened with the speech, so I won't comment further.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And Ms. Margarita?
Thank you very much. I am Margarita de la Pisa, member of the European Parliament, Patriots from Vox Party in Spain, and I'm working in the FEM committee, that is the committee about women rights and gender equality, also in SAN committee, because I am pharmaceutics, and also in Apple committee. So in the three committees, we touch this because gender ideology, always in FEM committee, but also in SANT, pharma legislation, and but also in Apple, because we might understand the role of the family as a in the social dimension. I would like to start to say thank you. I really appreciate your presence here, because in these days, this work, debates help us a lot as deputies to find arguments to lead with these topics in the different files and in the different legislation initiative. Last week, the Commission presented the LGTB strategy that have this kind of input, so I really appreciate the path that Ms. Jenny Reitz makes, and to be brave, because I understand that it's have to be brave to go in contrary, about, also, Mia, thank you very much for your testimony and your inputs, because I think that will help us a lot to work with fighting against this gender ideology, but also transgender ideology, because we have to understand that the gender ideology is sometimes comes together with women's rights, but it's part of the same issue, because the little steps have been taken calling for this. And also, Luka, thank you very much for being here. You touch my heart when you talk about the need of adults, and come to me as a mother, because I understand that the adults that we are here, maybe we didn't do it well, and we have to be sorry, because sometimes even, as I said before, calling for women's rights, we let this gender approach coming into our society, and we didn't see it come. Talking at the beginning with gender perspective and how this developed in this idea that we have not an identity, especially when you have to create your identity, especially of the understanding what it means to be a child, the immaturity of a child. A child will not understand even that they have a neck or they have fingers, the kind of immaturity. They don't know if they are themselves or they are part of their mothers. So the child is completely immature. They need a development and discover the world. And in this immaturity, when they have not even understanding of the world, even their own body, we start to make this kind of confusion, asking them if you are a boy or a girl, but maybe they even not know it. So first step is that we need to understand the kind of immaturity and the stage of development that the kids are, to understand the cruelty. Because of course that if they target the kids, they break our culture, because the understanding of the anthropology, nature will be break forever and ever. So if you affect the kids in this moment, you will affect all society. But of course that you will break this person, this self-confidence, because we have to understand that the first step for a child is to grow up in the stability and in the love of a family, to first learn what means be loved and love, tender confidence, and then maybe they will discover the sexuality. But in this hypersexualized society, we make them understand that all is sex, but they don't understand even the sexuality, you know. So it's horrible because they are really, it's a great ingerence in the personality of the child. So they confuse in the identity, they vulnerate their innocence and intimidity because the sexuality is something intimate. Also, they push them to try, but nobody talk about the how much it hurts this test. Because of course that we born to love and to be loved, but nobody talk about the fidelity and the monogamy and something that, you know, is to build a family. So they, in a way, instrumentalize the relationships. And of course, the gender education and sexual education will be always just talking about sexuality, never about affection. But this breaks an important dimension that is a need for every human being, that it's even more basic news than drink or even nouritude. The first is to be love and have affection and relationship. So also because in a way of medical science, we are using treatment without any test. We don't know we know the long-term secondary effects and really might avoid, and also the surgeries that really go against the integrity of every human being just because the consent of a child cannot be taken into account. So we have to stand for our kids. I have been always trying to put this as a priority, but today I have to hear you, that you just need an adult. We have to see that now our role of deputies is to stand and to protect our childs, because they are really in a very dangerous situation if we let them alone with this kind of ideology in their schools. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margarita. So I've come with several questions, and I'm sure all of you have a lot of questions as well. But I think to ground the discussion, one of the most fundamental things is to get a definition clear, especially when we're talking about gender ideology. So I'd like to open the floor also for any of the questions. Feel free, anyone, to add something that you think would add value to it. Ms. Hughes, we hear the term gender ideology constantly, but almost never with a clear definition. In your view, what exactly is this ideology that we're talking about, and what makes it especially a threat to children?
Thank you for the question. So I call it gender identity ideology. I think it's a more precise term. Gender identity ideology is the belief system that tells us that what makes a person a man, a woman, a boy, or a girl is not the reality of their body, but it's their gender identity. So first and foremost, it tells us that everybody possesses a gender identity, and it is that gender identity that makes you a man, a woman, a boy, or a girl. Now, there's no evidence, there's never been any evidence for the existence of gender identities. It's a political ideology that the term gender identity came out of the 1960s, the field of psychiatry, when nobody really understood what was motivating the men who showed up wishing to be women. The political trans rights movement adopted this label, gender identity, in the 1990s and turned it into, it was rather more like a pseudo-legal concept that they just embedded into international law. There's no actual biological test to test for someone's gender identity. It's entirely an inner subjective feeling, and only you, as it goes, only you know what your gender identity is. The reason it's so dangerous for children is because if you tell a child that they can choose, that their inner feelings define whether they're a boy or a girl. Their body is not important. It's how they feel on the inside that defines whether they're a boy or a girl. And children are very literal-minded. They don't understand the world in the same way that we do. And so a little boy who likes princess gowns and Barbie dolls, he will take that to mean that that means he's a girl. That means he possesses a female gender identity. But in actual fact, he's just a little boy who likes princess gowns and Barbie dolls. And the important thing about that little boy is all of the scientific literature tells us that he is destined almost certainly to grow up to be a homosexual adult, because extreme gender nonconformity in childhood is strongly correlated with homosexuality in adulthood. So it's just, none of it is true. It's a political construct that we are teaching to children as if it's scientific fact, and that's extremely dangerous.
Thank you. I get the sense that part of the weight behind it is that it lies in this ambiguity, that it's very hard to exactly define. I'd like to turn to Luka. Your personal story is something that not a lot of people are familiar with, especially how you got to where you are today. You mentioned you mentioned about your transition, some of your past. I'm curious to know if you had to identify a single moment when the adults in the room failed you, what would that be? Either in the clinics or...
It would probably have to be the moment that these clinicians, knowing everything that had been going on in my life, knowing every single red flag and comorbidity that in a sane world should have shot up alarm bells, that there was something else going on here, and that this need to escape my body at such a young age, that should have been an alarm for these professionals. And the moment that I feel like truly failed is when every single one of them ignored all of those ringing alarm bells and signed off on helping me escape my body further after everything that happened.
And now in the detransitioning phase, is there something you think that the public would or still misunderstands about the experience?
I think most of the public, it's very hard to grasp just how eager some of these clinicians are to just go ahead and affirm anything. When a mentally ill 14-year-old comes into a clinic and is telling you that they hate their body and that they wish they looked different, and all of these things, they tell you they have trauma, they've been groomed, there's been just countless things going on. I don't think the public is all that aware that it doesn't matter to some of these clinicians, everything else going on. The minute you say the magical words, I identify as, there's almost no turning back from there. It is a path towards medicalization. And once that medicalization is done, there is no undoing it fully. You can't get back body parts that get chopped off. You can't fully undo years of hormone therapy or blockers that impact your growth and development and your endocrine system. You can't undo that. You can try. You can try and detransition, but there will always be things that are damaged. It's not a simple, just take a step back and you're back to how you were. You will live with the consequences of what happened for the rest of your life. And oftentimes, not only are medical professionals not interested in helping you when you try to go back, when you try and salvage the damage done, oftentimes they will be outright hostile towards you. Because in the mind of a clinician that deals in gender identity, someone who wants to go back, who wants to detransition, shouldn't exist. And if you've put your entire life's work into transitioning children, the thought that you could have actually been hurting someone is often too much for some of these clinicians to grasp, so they will dig their heels in. And they will say to you that you, as a young teenager who is struggling and reaching out for help, but that it was your fault that it happened. The level of cruelty behind this entire ideology, I don't feel like the general public truly understands, and the impact that that has on often these struggling teenagers that are going through it.
Thank you. Those are very powerful and gut-wrenching insights. Yes, please.
There's one thing that I want to add about gender identity ideology that goes with Luka's story here. So the reason that early trans activists chose to launch their movement based on gender identities was precisely so that they could remove all of the psychiatric guardrails, gatekeeping they call it, from this drastic medical pathway that Luka went down, because they saw the need for psychiatry to intervene, the need for a diagnosis. They saw that as some kind of transphobic gatekeeping. So instead, they framed it as a healthy gender identity. There's no need for psychiatry. But when they did that, they removed all the guardrails that were necessary to prevent Luka from the medical harm that she's experienced.
Turning to Ms. Reed, we're hearing a lot about how these clinics went through with some of these procedures. You spent some time in these clinics, and you were brave enough to step forward and blow the whistle, pull up the sheet, as it were. Could you walk us through what that's like? What were some of the patterns that you noticed, some of the practices which made you suddenly see red?
Thank you for that question. One of the things I found so interesting is that the patterns that I saw in the United States actually were mirrored or began first here on the continent. So the Tavistock in the UK was a gender center, the primary gender center in Britain. The whistleblowers that first came out of Tavistock saw three patterns that I also began to see directly in the United States. I do believe that these clinics see very similar things. So the first was the spike in the number of young people presenting. When I started in the Gender Center in 2018, I intaked and assessed 4 new patients per month. When I left in 2022, I was intaking and assessing 65 new patients per month. The Tavistock reported a 5,000% increase. It was very similar to the huge influx and spike that I saw in the United States. So the first was simply the number of children presenting went dramatically out of control. I don't know that the early trans activists anticipated this social contagion. I think in some ways it actually harmed their movement, but we saw a huge social contagion break out amongst the adolescent girls. So the first pattern I saw was the increase in number. The second was that the presenting cohort itself changed radically. So the early children presenting were often pre-pubertal, very feminine little boys who were being brought to the clinic because they were struggling in preschool, the early elementary school ages. They were struggling with their peers. Their parents saw them as being bullied. They were the first or the often children being brought. By the time I left, 80% of our patient population was teen girls between the age of 15 and 17. They all presented with very similar stories. Most of them did not have any early childhood gender distress. And then the third thing that I saw as a pattern that we've seen across most of Europe also is that these children are presenting with significant mental health comorbidities. Huge spikes in the rate of autism, trauma, and vastly, usually underrepresented mental health conditions, borderline personality disorders, bipolar disorders, somatization disorders. These were very ill young people who were not treated for their mental health comorbidities. Instead, they were sold a panacea that gender is the answer to all of your woes, and a medical transition will cure you of all of your concerns. I think those are probably the three patterns that I saw that were also mirrored and have been continuing to mirror across Western Europe as well.
Thank you for that. Turning to Margarita, moving towards Western Europe, coming into the sphere of Brussels, you mentioned you work on you're a member of the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality. What is the sentiment here in Brussels, in the Parliament, and in various EU institutions towards this ideology?
Any moment that you try to critique or just express concerns, you are pointed out as that you spread hate speech and that you are not respecting the human dignity. So they align the human dignity and integration to just follow completely, 100%, this ideology that start maybe with the Istanbul Convention, trying to break the stereotypes of women and also criminalization and breaking the idea that there are a biological behavior that can be manifest in many ways, but breaking this idea, the first step to break this idea and develop till transgender, because they starting with this women fight against, and roles. But do you remember 15 years ago, they tried to explain the families in Christmas campaigns that may let your child play with your boy with dolls and then your girls, and trying to make, it doesn't matter which kind of toys the kids use it. But the reality is that they are noting. Now they say, okay, if you are a boy and you play with dolls, doesn't matter, because it can be you are a boy, but there are different. Each person is unique, and the interest of each person is unique. Then you start to say that this boy maybe have woman interest, so they came with the opposite that they have been supposed promoting. So now, if the boy play with dolls means something, it's completely the opposite. So this is a fake ideology, but it's terrible how many contradictions and lies are always there. And calling the rights of women, they are going against women's completely, because they always spread the idea that the woman profile and the woman interests are something that are burdens, and, for example, spirit of service, the maternity is a burden. We have to avoid the maternity. And so that's at the moment. For example, the other day there was this LGTB presentation strategy, and we raised the hand saying, so sorry, we have huge concerns about what you are saying, because you have to know that there are people that comes into this kind of treatments now have regrets, and there are irreversible secondary effects, and these treatments means chronic patients, because so we need to say it. It's our responsibility to alarm and they even not answer, say, do you know what it means, human dignity? This kind of superiority. So now anyone that say something about this ideology, it's anti-gender movement. But even talk about family, talk about the maternity. For example, they understand this trans wife movement, women that are pro to take care of their kids, sometimes preventing this kind of ideologies that comes from the school, sometimes because they understand that family time is important to the develop of their child and their personality, because they don't want to let the kids in the screens. they say that it's worse than the prostitution. So they compare the women that decide to take care of, because it's a regression on women's rights. So because it's a regression, it's anti-gender movement. So just protect family means that you are against human rights, anti-democracy, and also they are making the link with Christian culture. They say that it's because we are radicals, that we are Christians, that's why we are preventing and not let our kids to express themselves and to love who they want to love. This is because they also call this kind of measures love, dignity, freedom. So it's really difficult because they put a very nice paper, wrap it very well, so they present it as amazing. They are presenting in this, even in Fem Committee, with Barbies, with cartoons. So presenting, using the kids' even imagination, as you explained. So of course that they are using the kids to develop all of these kind of behaviors. So it's really dramatic, as you say. We have to understand the evil behind this ideology, because I remember last Monday I was saying, I understand that you don't understand, because it's so evil. You cannot even imagine. And the little step that they have been given, to make us, as a society, to normalize this. We have to say that this ideology have clinic impact. Many diseases, the loneliness, the depression. Imagine, we are saying the kids that their perception is their identity. Imagine to say a girl with anorexia that their perception, it's okay. She will not eat anymore and she will die. But it's almost the same. But as you see now, nobody's talking about anorexia and bulimia as before, because of course that the perception can not be well adapted, but this is a mental health issue. But now we have to legitimize the perception of a child that they are still in a fantasy world. So, but that's how they comes against us. We are anti-gender, anti-human rights, anti-democracy, and we are not respecting the dignity. But of course that we are going to keep saying the mission, for sure.
Thank you. I'd like to turn a little bit towards education, and especially the role that the schools play, the atmosphere in which kids are being exposed to some of this ideology. As I know, we have, I think, 3 parents on the stage, so this is an open question. What level of transparency or parental involvement should be considered the minimum standard when schools start to discuss teaching gender ideology, gender studies, anything like that in school?
You can start.
Well, first of all, because gender ideology is not true, it shouldn't be taught in schools at all. I think we're a long way from it being completely removed from all school curricula. That absolutely must be the goal. No child should be exposed to it. I think in the interim period, at the very least, I know that these classes sometimes have an opt-out. Parents are allowed to opt their children out, but a much better solution is the opt-in. And even then, I don't think any parent should have the right to opt their child in, but that means that no child is exposed to this unless the parent is fully and completely aware of it. But it's difficult really for me to comment because I do not think it belongs in any education, and no child should be exposed to it.
I'm going to absolutely agree with everything that you said, but I'm going to add another element that we struggle with in the United States, and that has to do with flags in school. So in the US, we will have states or jurisdictions that have been attempting to pass laws regarding what flags can be flown either within a classroom or outside of a school. We see the trans flag, rainbow flags, and what's referred to as the Progress Pride flag being in schools as children walk into the building. This is being flown alongside of the American flag, their state flag. It's one thing to remove the teaching, but then we also have to recognize that part of this being an ideology is it also uses visual imagery. It will use things like language or flags to promote itself even when, it's not being in the curriculum. The organization that I work with is a gay and lesbian organization, and we actually take the stance that there should be no flags in any public spaces that are not part of your government flag or your state local flag. We don't believe that any sexual orientation or gender ideology flag should be anywhere in public spheres like that. We believe that it simply promotes some ideological concepts that children don't need to be walking in underneath a flag flying, promoting an ideology.
Thank you. There's still hundreds of thousands of questions that I could put forward that I'm sure all of you have as well, but because we are running out of time, I'd like to give all of you a chance in closing that we're joined by quite a lot of members of parliament, a lot of people who work in policy. What is the most important message you want EU lawmakers to take away from this conversation and today's conference? And we can start with Margarita.
I was curious about the message that they will say them to us, because it's important to hear them. For me, it's maybe it's not always that easy against full gender ideology. Not try to, because if we don't work against the gender ideology in the complexity, starting from the beginning of this bad understanding of women's role in the society, because it's trying to break roles but building others, we will not heal the society. But I'm curious to know what our guests will transmit to us.
My final message would be, as I said in my opening remarks, that children deserve a childhood grounded in truth. And it's the responsibility of us as adults and anyone in a position of power to safeguard that right, safeguard their right to grow up healthy and whole. And you face a choice. You face a choice of giving in to the demands of a political movement that has no grounding in reality, or safeguarding children. And you cannot do both, because the two are in direct conflict with each other, and it is a zero-sum game. So if you want to prioritize children, you have to rid all of society of this ideology that confuses them into thinking that they need body parts chopped off. It confuses them into thinking that they need powerful drugs in order to find peace and happiness. And I will say that there is a way to also protect people who identify as transgender without this anti-reality ideology. You don't have to live in this fictional world in order to protect the rights of people who identify as transgender. So my final words are just put children first. Make the safety of children the top priority. Thank you.
My message would be very similar to one I have given to many of the state legislatures that I have testified in over in the States, is that you are in a position of power to be the adults in the room, and you have a duty to stand grounded in truth and reality to protect some of the most vulnerable among us. When medical experimentation is being disguised as artificial progress and targeting some of the most struggling and vulnerable in society, as someone in a position of power, you have a duty to step in and say no and stop this and stand grounded in reality. Stop affirming this chaos into reality.
I hope I'm not going to be too controversial. I believe that trans ideology is the most homophobic idea that has ever been created. And so I recognize right now that there is a civil war within the LGB and the TQ community. And if you are seeking to make legal and policy changes, be open to some of the strangest collaborations, or we say strangest bedfellows in the US. So I work with some of the most extreme religious organizations to get trans ideology out of medicine and law. So sometimes I would just say be open to partnering with adult homosexuals who recognize that trans ideology is actually destroying the gay and lesbian community. And if you're open to working with those communities, recognize that you actually might be able to advance the policies you are seeking, because it's the adult gays and lesbians, the adult homosexuals who can directly attack your liberals and fight them right back, fire for fire, and explain how this is a human rights abuse against homosexuals. And oftentimes that is one of the best strategies to win.
Thank you all for your candor, your insights. These are difficult conversations, but essential ones. And I hope today's discussion and the following panels will help inform better policy, better research, and above all, better protection for children. Thank you.